Everyone, so we just got a phenomenal chapter of One Piece. Like, seriously, this is probably the most exciting move that Oda could possibly have done in terms of further establishing the world government as this terrifying endgame threat. Because the one thing that I think a lot of people felt coming away from Egghead Island was some level of ambivalence about the Gorosei. Because while the Gorosei were clearly very strong and very powerful, and, you know, they've got all this crazy regeneration and immortality and these powerful Zoan forms, and they can do crazy things like, Venus Juro cutting Egghead Island in half, or like Warcury tanking Luffy's strongest attacks and making Luffy hurt himself. There's a lot that the Gorosei flexed and showed off, but I think that ultimately we didn't quite get that feeling of, oh yeah, these guys are definitely across the board just the most menacing endgame threats possible. And I think a large part of that is because, one, Oda couldn't really have the Gorosei win or succeed too much, because this was an arc about the Straw Hats succeeding, right? So he couldn't really have the Gorosei flex by giving the Straw Hats a beatdown, but at the same time he had to showcase enough to establish that, yeah, they are top tiers, like Admiral level, whatever you want to say, or above. It just didn't quite feel that way because they didn't really succeed or do that much against the Straw Hats at the end of the day. The one moment that it finally seemed like the Gorosei were all lined up and assembled and ready to just stomp the Straw Hats, well, Joyboy's Haki came in clutch and just saved the day. And I think the other major factor in why the Gorosei maybe didn't feel quite as menacing to people as they had hoped is that some of the Gorosei are not quite as strong as the others. So on the one end of the spectrum, again, you have Warcury, who can basically tank attacks that even cause Kaido a lot of damage, and in fact not only just tank them, but actually make Luffy hurt instead. On the other end of the spectrum, you have like Saturn, who basically bruised like a peach from pretty much any character that he came up against. I mean, forget Luffy, because Luffy could essentially low diff Saturn at the same time as Luffy was low diffing Kizaru. Literally, Saturn went up against the weakest Straw Hat, and they were all able to fend him off. Kuma, with his body in complete tatters, no consciousness left in his brain, was able to show up and send Saturn flying across the city. And even Bonnie, without using any Devil Fruit abilities right off the bat, just came up and stabbed Saturn. Pretty much everyone got a piece of Saturn throughout the arc, and it didn't seem that difficult. And so while we understood that technically this character is probably supposed to be top tier, like Admiral level-ish or something, it really didn't feel that way. And when one of the Gorosei, the one that we see the most often throughout the arc, kind of feels a bit like a punching bag, it almost sort of brings down the average in a sense. It doesn't help that Jupiter wasn't too impressive either. I think it's not really till you get to Mars that it starts to feel like the Gorosei are somewhat impressive. Then of course Venus Juro, pretty impressive, and then Warcury, fairly impressive. But overall, I think the whole group could have been kicked up one more notch. And with this chapter, we basically get it. So I'm going to talk about this at length in next Tuesday's video. But Figarland Garling is likely the strongest Gorosei, and not just the strongest Gorosei. I think people are severely underestimating just how strong this character has now become after having ascended to Gorosei status. So again, next week's video is going to be heavily breaking that down, because I think Figarland Garling is set to be one of the most important villains in all of One Piece. And I think currently it is very likely that he's at least one of the top 5 strongest characters in the world, and could be a lot closer to 2 or 3 than a lot of people realize. So again, next week's video will be breaking that down at length. And here's the thing, cutting out Saturn, so cutting out the weakest Gorosei, and then adding in someone stronger than the rest of the Gorosei, that ramps up our perception of the Gorosei's overall strength a lot. So this was just one of the best moves Oda could possibly have done. He'd likely planned this for a long time. It makes so much sense. Saturn was the primary villain of this entire arc. He was going to be the weakest of Imu's subordinates from the beginning, and therefore the first one to be removed, and kind of a showcase to the reader a lot of things. One, it establishes just how evil and nasty the Gorosei are, while allowing us to see a Gorosei basically get their comeuppance in the arc itself, and at the same time getting to understand how the Gorosei's relationship with Imu is, in that Imu seems to give them power in return for absolute subservience, and when they fail, they are killed, they have their immortality taken away, and Imu appoints a new Celestial Dragon who is more deserving in their stead, and that is essentially how the cycle of the Gorosei has worked over the centuries. And finally, it allows Oda to introduce a new, even more threatening final Gorosei as the end boss, obviously before the actual end boss, Imu. So Oda's usage of Saturn throughout this arc was just a masterstroke, able to set up such a great villain for the storyline, have him get his just desserts, and at the same time establish so many lore implications basically about how the Gorosei in general work, give us a taste of what's to come, and understand just the stakes that the Gorosei are working with, why their motivations are the way they are to serve Imu so faithfully, how they get their power from Imu, their livelihood from Imu, and the consequences for failing to serve Imu properly. And what's most interesting is that the reason that Saturn was punished at the end of the day was simply for disobeying Imu, much in the same way that Saturn himself, that hypocrite, criticized humans for disobeying him throughout this arc. I mean, Saturn's whole thing was, why don't humans just obey? Why do they always feel the need to rebel? Why can't they just follow commands? Why do they feel the need to try and dig up information and unearth what they're not supposed to unearth? And look, Saturn at the end of the day was punished for doing exactly what Imu ordered him not to do. Saturn just couldn't control his own curiosity. He wanted to know more about the ancient robot, and so he, whether he realized it or not, rebelled and secretly went about researching it further, and what do you know, that backfired him on the end. He got exposed for his rebellion and punished for it. And you know what that just goes to show? The line that Saturn had in this arc was basically something like, why do humans feel the need to do what they're told not to do? Saturn's own undoing was doing exactly what he was told not to do. You know why that is? Because Saturn is human. The celestial dragons are all humans. They all share the same blood as humans. They were all one and the same, living with other humans 800 years ago. They just selected themselves out to go live as celestial godly rulers up in Marijua, but that's just a self-proclaimed title. They share the same blood as humans. They're humans just the same as any peasant from any poor country. Saturn himself is human, and so he suffers from the same flaws as humans despite thinking of himself as somehow being above them. So just the delicious irony of why Saturn was ultimately killed is an excellent way to close out that villain and this arc. In general, the scene of Saturn's punishment and death is one of the most visceral and brutal scenes that Oda has ever depicted. Like, he has never depicted death in that manner before, and it's deserving of a character like Saturn. So definitely a character like him, I feel like Oda may not hold back in just making it as horrifying and painful as possible. Again, I'm going to save my thoughts on Figarland Garling for next Tuesday's video because it is going to be a very in-depth breakdown. There are a lot of things about this character that I don't think people are really recognizing or realizing right now, so wait for that video. But beyond that, I want to talk quickly about the Vegapunks. So I'm going to be honest, in general, the way that the Vegapunks' minds work and how when a certain Vegapunk dies, it seems like consciousnesses transfer over to different Vegapunks. I don't know where the hierarchy of that goes, because Lilith started getting different Vegapunks aspects to their personalities added to her after, Egghead Island ended, but at the same time, it's not like she got their consciousness. For example, York is still around, but Lilith just picked up greed again, so I guess that's not literally getting the York's consciousness back, just that aspect of her personality is returning to Lilith, I suppose, in some way. But then at the same time, you have Edison and Shaka and Pythagoras and Atlas all forming their own cluster over here. I don't know why they all flocked into one brain necessarily. And with the Stella, I suppose whatever personality aspect that represented, if it represented anything in particular, I suppose that is now simply gone, since it doesn't seem to have manifested in any of the, I guess you would say, 3 Vegapunks that now exist. The York Vegapunk, Lilith Vegapunk, and then that Frankenstein hybrid Vegapunk. I really don't know how I feel about that Frankenstein hybrid Vegapunk at this point. The role that it's going to play down the line, I think it is extremely funny that the way that Oda had Punk Records go and become a literal cloud, I think there's still people who don't fully understand that Punk Records in general, if you go back and read Vegapunk's explanation of what Punk Records is supposed to be, it's supposed to be an information hub where people can share information across the globe with each other in theory, and people can input their information, gain information, instantly access the information of others. It's a worldwide connected web of information is what Punk Records is supposed to be. Punk Records, if you read Vegapunk's explanation, it is a very tongue-in-cheek way of Oda basically talking about the internet. Punk Records is the One Piece version of the internet that Vegapunk is developing, which is why this chapter's development of Punk Records literally flying off into the sky on a cloud, becoming the internet up there as a cloud, it's very, very on the nose. It's just a hilarious little real-world referential idea that Oda is capping the arc off with, that just this thing, this floating cloud of information now exists that one day 500 years or so from now will basically function as Vegapunk intended and allow everyone to connect and share information. Basically like the internet's going to exist in One Piece a few centuries from now. It's a funny concept. It's one of those things where I don't know if Oda actually wants to reincorporate that into the modern day story, or if he just likes that existing as a funny concept that he's written into the story as is. It's hard to say, but the fact that it seems like there is a plot line still out there for the Vegapunks with them connecting to Witheria, which is a nice connection for sure, in that it seems like there's so many connections between these various scholars that we've seen. You know, Clover to Vegapunk, Vegapunk to Haradas and Witheria. I like those aspects of the lore. But as for which direction the plot is going, that's really, really hard to say. Whether it's going to be significant down the line or not, whether Punk Records really is just this fun little idea that Oda has to include in the story that's not actually going to influence the plot from here on. I do have one significant idea as to how Punk Records could be very, very relevant in the modern day story, but I might save that for a theory video down the line. And lastly, we have what Dragon said at the end of this chapter. To begin with, I like the fact that Tequila Wolf was referenced again. I like the fact that something like that was not forgotten by Oda, because there's so many lore aspects that exist in One Piece, so many open threads, and Tequila Wolf was one of those really, really niche ones that still raised a lot of question marks and people were really curious about, but it wasn't really ever referenced again. It was like, did Oda forget about it or something like that? And then it turns out, no, it just took a long time for its relevance to become apparent. So I love that little reveal, but it leads into Dragon's proclamation that there is now going to be a war in the world over a certain resource, which is land. Safe land that will be above the rising sea level. So war is coming. I remember people, I've got so much I could rant again about with Vegapunk's speech. I remember last time I talked about it, a lot of people in the comments put up a lot of poor defenses. A lot of the defenses were ones that I directly explained why they were incorrect in the chapter review itself. But I'll just say here something very simple, which is that no, it never made any sense that Vegapunk's reason for not talking about the world government specifically as being the perpetrators of having the ancient weapon today would be because it would cause chaos among people. Chaos is very obviously already going to occur, as is established by the end of this chapter. The only thing that's going to happen now is everyone's going to try to kill each other. So the world's essentially going to tear itself apart thanks to Vegapunk's reveal. The one thing he could have done if he was trying to be genuinely helpful is, instead of just allowing people to kill each other, Vegapunk could have pointed people towards the actual problem, which he knew and established for a fact he knew was the problem in chapter 1123. It was the world government. So instead, we're just going to get people mindlessly killing each other for land because they don't know who the actual bad guys are who are trying to kill them, which is the world government. So congratulations, Vegapunk, what a genius. The unfortunate thing is I actually like the character of Vegapunk quite a bit. I think he's a very tragic and very interesting character. I think it's just extremely contrived that Oda had Vegapunk give this elaborate speech and then leave out the one most important, most crucial piece of information for the entire world from that speech. It's just very clearly just an Oda decision because he doesn't want that reveal about the world government to make it out into the broader world so soon. That has to happen at the very climax of the story, so he just doesn't have Vegapunk really reveal it for no real logical reason at all, and so people have to headcanon a lot of things that are not once implied by a single line of text in the story as to being some reason as to why Vegapunk did not include the information about the world government clearly having the ancient weapon, which was a fact that he concluded for himself in chapter 1123. But that's enough talking about that, because aside from that, the chapter as a whole was absolutely phenomenal. Figarland Garling being established as a Gorosei, one of the coolest moves possible for the rest of the story, an extremely exciting villain, and I'm going to have a video breaking down everything that is to come and the potential of this villain in next Tuesday's video, so watch out for that, and with that, I will talk to you all later.